Our scholars didn't have the confidence to succeed. It wasn't because they didn't have the ability. It was truly, in my opinion, because they didn't have the confidence. And so we introduced strengths as a way to have similar language, but honestly to help them understand what makes them so special and use that then to pivot towards showing up at their very best every day.
So for 2 years now, every new student has learned what their top 5 strengths are. And I fully believe that when people know what it is I'm good at, I might have a shot at being good at things. And so I think about it all the time as we're here to help students be the best versions of themselves with a great education. And so learning to leverage your strengths and quit focusing on maybe how I don't match up to someone else, but here's my strengths and here's what I'm good at. It's at the core of what we're doing in our entire student success effort.
A strength-based approach helps students, one, understand more about their strengths. It helps them to be more authentically themselves so that they can navigate college within their own selves. It helps to build the confidence. It helps to enforce more positive well-being for the student while being on campus. And all those things go into how well a student feels like they matter and belong on campus. And so I think that directly ties into our retention and graduation rates. When a student feels like they belong at UT, when they feel like they're confident in themselves and they can be them authentic selves on campus, all of those things go into how well a student matriculates at the university.
At a university institutional level, our retention rates have gone up, you know? So it's this individualistic piece, but then when we're able to see that at the core, we've had our highest retention rates that we've seen. We hope that next year will be even higher. And it's all about creating these structures where students can thrive and helping them understand their story, but more importantly, that their story matters to us in the volunteer community.
Good afternoon, everyone, and a really warm welcome to this afternoon's session, and apologies that we had to cut Luke short. What an amazing job he did on our behalf at the Press Club. I think it's really an amazing opportunity for us this afternoon to focus on something I think is so positive for the Australian sector, but also beyond. We'll hear shortly from the UK, which is our long-standing track record in transnational education. There have been lots of tough topics discussed in the last 24 hours, and transnational education in the last year has very much been a topic that's been focused on how we might, when we turn off the international onshore tap, we can turn on the T&E tab, and that's such a reductionist way of thinking about T&E. So it's great this afternoon to have the opportunity to explore further how transnational education can be leveraged for global influence. But first, let me just say who I am. I'm Saskia Loer Hansen, the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, International and Engagement at RMIT University, and we're a university with a 40-year history in transnational education, and we feel very passionate about how we work and engage with the broader region. I'm excited to be joined today by a former colleague from when I worked in the UK, Jamie Arrowsmith, Director of the University's UK International, with a long history within the University's UK, navigating how best to corral more than 140 member universities. We think it can be difficult with 39 institutions in Australia, but getting 140 institutions together and a focus on international engagement activity in that context. But also you have an understanding from the other side, having worked as an academic in the Education and Social Research Institute, and then moved into higher education policy within the University's UK. And we also have Leighton Ernsberger, Director of Education East Asia with British Council. And Leighton also brings with him a long-standing track record, 17 years working on higher education and skills policy in the UK, South Asia and East Asia, spending time in India and having worked in Singapore since 2019, and working really closely with government, Asian Development Bank, the European Union and UK partners to change the world in terms of the impact of education. So amazing colleagues to have in the room with us today. I know we have a very short period of time, so we will start the discussion, but then we also invite questions from the audience. And we do have a roving mic as well. If anybody just wants to put their hand up, you're more than welcome to do that. But maybe first, Jamie, could you tell us a little bit more about your role within the Universities UK, and then what the T&E landscape looks like from the British perspective?
Thank you. And it's great to be back at the Universities Australia conference after, I think, 5 or 6 years, which is good. As Saskia said, so Universities UK, we're the sister organisation to Universities Australia. And actually, it's been, I think, depressingly familiar from all of the things that have been spoken about from Luke and from the Minister earlier, that we're hearing in the UK as well. Everything from sort of focus on academic freedom to Vice-Chancellor's salaries. So it's good to see that wherever we are, the debates are pretty much the same. We have 141 university members. That can be challenging, but I spoke to a colleague from the Association of Indian Universities, and they have 20 times as many as us. So I think even our membership is relatively manageable from that side. So as Universities UK International, we're a department within the wider organisation, but we were set up about kind of 12, 13 years ago, really to support the UK university community to internationalise. And so we focus on all aspects of global engagement. So I'm the director of that unit, and sort of my team, we actually have 25 people, so it's a really significant function within the organisation. And so our priorities, we've got kind of 5 broad policy areas that we work on. So fostering global research innovation collaboration, attracting global talent, so that includes international students, but also staff as well. We have a program around responsible internationalization, which brings together our work around humanitarian response, but also the trusted research agenda, which I know is sort of really important here in Australia. Outward student mobility, but of course transnational education as well, and how we actually sort of expand the education partnerships that we have globally. So T&E has been important for the UK and for our universities for a very, very long time. And actually, if you had a colleague from the University of London here, they would be telling you they've been doing transnational education for over 100 years. And so that says something about the kind of the depth of experience, I think, that there is. But I think a couple of reflections on where we are in the UK at the moment. The last sort of set of data that we had, I think, suggested there were almost 600,000 students that are being educated on UK programs overseas. So it's a really, really significant sort of aspect of our international work. And that's from over 160 universities are doing some form of T&E. The asterisk against that is that I think there's a very long tail of institutions that are doing very small numbers and probably not hugely strategic. And in fact, the university might not know a huge amount about what certain academics have sort of set up in the past in terms of some of those partnerships. So that's a challenge. But we're also active in over 200 countries and territories globally as well. So it really is a sort of a significant area of work. I think just a couple of reflections from the UK experience. I think the first thing is there is no single model. So although we talk about transnational education, it is not a singular thing. So it is a spectrum of activities. So from branch campuses and really significant long-term investments at one end of the spectrum, all the way through partnership approaches, and I think increasingly working with third parties, so commercial third parties, in different markets as well, all the way to franchise and validation, which might be more of a transactional relationship as well. So there's a huge spectrum of activity within that kind of 600,000 or so sort of students. But it is really big, it's really important, and there's a huge amount of diversity there as well. I think the second reflection, just to pick up something you've just mentioned, it really is kind of, it seems to be the moment for T&E sort of in the UK at the moment. So yes, the numbers are very big, but I think the interest that we're seeing from university boards in particular has absolutely skyrocketed over the past kind of 6 to 12 months. And actually a return to thinking about branch campuses in a way that I don't think has been there in the past kind of 5 or 10 years. They're seeing it as a very big risky investment. All of a sudden there's a lot of focus on what the opportunity might be. And I think that the reason for that, and this is the kind of third point I'd raise, is that I think the context is the very significant uncertainty in international recruitment, and this is being seen as potentially a mechanism to hedge against some of those the reductions that we're seeing in international recruitment. But I think our very clear steer would be one is not a replacement for the other. They have to be complementary activities. They offer different things, but T&E, there's a really significant cost attached to it, and it always comes with risk as well. So expecting this to be the mechanism that can replace onshore recruitment, I don't think that's the case. And just the final thing I'll add before I'll sort of finish is that what's the kind of government involvement in this from the UK side? I think, frankly, universities have been doing this for a long time. They're autonomous institutions. They don't need government to tell them that this is an important thing to do. But government can have quite an important role facilitating that. We have an international education strategy in the UK. It's been in existence since 2019. TNE features in that, but it's currently under review, and what we've argued for is that there needs to be a bigger focus on the strategic role that TNE can play in supporting the wider objectives of the UK government and universities as well within that. And I guess the sort of final point is that I don't think the UK has been particularly smart in the way that it's tried to use things like trade agreements in terms of trying to create those international links for our universities. But I'll stop there.
Okay, great, Jamie. Lots of things that we can come back to. But maybe, Leighton, we yesterday heard the British High Commissioner talk so passionately about the impact that transnational education and international education more broadly can have. Why, from the British Council perspective, is TNE important? And what are some of the factors you see underpinning that importance in terms of global influence and reach?
Thank you very much, Saskia. Let me start by saying it's a real privilege to be able to speak to you all today. I'm really pleased to be at this conference. It's amazing to hear the conversations that are happening in Australia. They're not unfamiliar by any means, but they're really important. I mean, I come from the education sector. It's been where my professional life is. And I think education is a public good, and that makes it valuable in and of itself. I'll tell you a little bit about my role, if that's okay, in the British Council, because I think it sets the context to why the British Council sees TNE as such an important part of the work that we support the UK to do overseas. The British Council is a charity registered in the UK, but we're also what we call an arm's length body of the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office in the UK. So we're independent, but we do receive funding from the UK government also. We're present in over 100 countries around the world. I think we're fairly well known for what we do. We work a lot in English, we work a lot in education, we work a lot in arts. That does make us quite unique amongst the cultural institutions that you see from other organizations, because we do cover so much. And I think it's because of that the British Council, and my joy at working at the British Council, allows me to think a little bit about what is the active ingredient to what makes education so influential, right? Why is it a soft power asset, right? We only really work on two elements of it, as the High Commissioner said yesterday. We work a lot on arts, and I think the active ingredient in what makes art a soft power asset is it's an engine for empathy. To paraphrase Roger Ebert, it can really build great understanding in whoever's watching it, right? In a way that so little else can. So there's a real active ingredient in arts, in sports diplomacy, which we don't do. I wish we did, but we don't. I think it's interesting because it gives a very productive side to competition, right? Friendly competition, and in the international landscape, it's better than war, right? So obviously, sports plays an important part in international relations. For me, it's a good question to ask: what is the active ingredient in why education is such an important global influence and soft power access? And for me, it's mutual benefit. That's the active ingredient in education, because it is a private good. We've all been through education, and it's benefited us. But I don't think the debate is whether it's a public good. It is a public good. And I think when international education is done well, it's a public good to the home country, to the UK, to the UK institution, or the Australian and the Australian institution, but it's also a public good in the host institution and the host country where it's done well. So from the British Council's perspective, we've been around for over 90 years, and we've worked on education that whole time. And I think the landscape of international education has changed dramatically over that period, right? I think a lot of the discussions with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and the UK government in general, when the UK government revises the international education strategy, is when we first published it, it was too obsessively focused on students, on student mobility, right? And it was education exports, right? So it did focus on other aspects of education, but largely from an export's perspective. But that's not the power of education. It is mutual benefit, right? It is that powers of attraction. It's everything that the High Commissioner said yesterday, and presumably it's why when universities do work overseas, they enjoy working overseas, because it brings mutual benefit. So from my perspective, I think what we've been advocating for at the British Council, working with the UKI and other sector partners, is trying to understand the strategic partnership that TNE is a part of. So if you look at East Asia, which is the area that I cover, I look after our work in education. That covers our work promoting the UK as a study destination, our work promoting UK education overseas. My role covers 14 countries in the region, in Southeast Asia, China, Northeast Asia, Australasia. It's a really big area, right? It's a big part of the Indo-Pacific. And I also worked in South Asia, so I've had the pleasure of working there too. But if you just look at East Asia, TNE has been around for so many decades, right? And it didn't happen because government policy pushed it out. It happened because it brought value to the home institution. I think Luke used a really important phrase, which is international education is additive. It's additive to the home institution, it's additive to the host institution. And it's come about organically, and it's had some failures, it's had some models that really don't need to survive, it has other models that should survive. And if you look at East Asia, I think there is a balanced approach. You would see that 1/3 of our research international collaborations come from what I would call East Asia, 1/3 of our TNE enrollments come from East Asia, 1/3 of our student mobility comes from East Asia. Right? So I think the strategic partnership between universities, both sort of internationally, is one that includes teaching and learning, that includes mobility, that includes research. And I think that's the type of international partnership in TNE that the British Council really wants to pursue. And so we produced a TNE strategy where we defined what we believe our role is. We're going to revise it, so if anybody wants us to do something different, Jamie, tell us.
I have been.
Perfect. We have 4 pillars. One is data and insights, right? Help us just understand what the data is telling us. The way that TNE is recorded in Australia is different to the UK, right? So we can make comparisons, but they're not directly comparable. All we know is that it's been growing in recent years for both countries, and I think that's a good thing. Yeah. We also have on-the-ground insight. The British Council has an incredible team across the district, right? I mean, I play a role in an international position, but the strength of the British Council is our local team in country. It's the insight that they have into the local education sector, that when UK institutions visit, or when ministers visit, or when officials visit, they get to meet my team, and they get a great amount of insight into what the local need is. We also want to do more on supporting education from a development perspective, because you will see a lot of governments want TNE. It's not the UK wants TNE. It's not Australia wants TNE. You look at Vietnam, they're actively engaged with us in policy reform. The Philippines government are investing in trying to build TNE capability to grow quality education in the domestic system. So it's really important from that perspective, whether governments want it, we want to help. And finally, even in mature markets, whether it's Malaysia, whether it's China, whether it's Singapore, working with the UK sector and UK government to advocate for reducing regulatory burden will also help that innovation to thrive. So those are the 4 aspects of the British Council's TNE strategy. It's, for me, an important reason to be here today, and I think the underlying message for it is don't see TNE as a replacement for international students. It's not. It's complementary. So if you think the only reason to do TNE is because you're going to lose students, that's not the reason to do TNE.
So could I just add one more point as well? I think it's something Leighton said about the kind of reciprocity. India has a stated ambition now to effectively have a 50% enrollment rate. We were in Nigeria for a Going Global conference, which British Council run early this year, and again, majority of the population is going to be under 18 in a few years. There is a huge need and desire to develop higher education capacity in those countries, and therefore there is an opportunity for systems like the UK and Australia, who have a lot of expertise and experience, to work with those partners to help develop that capacity, a quality capacity at scale. And so I think there really is a partnership opportunity, but it has to be approached through that. This is about the reciprocity and having kind of mutual benefit, not we're here to tell you how to do it. And I think that's absolutely key.
Yeah, no, and I must say from my experience in Australia, I absolutely agree with that. TNE is a long-term journey. It takes time to build the mutual respect, to build the mutual benefit. It's hard work, and it can be amazing when you achieve the outcomes, almost irrespective of which model it is, whether it's a campus model or a partnership model, or even some of the strong pathway and articulation programs that we all have. I think from the Australian perspective, we've probably been better at capturing some of the core elements around trade agreements in terms of strategic comprehensive partnerships that make reference to the importance of international education, of transnational education. We've seen the invested strategy, the Southeast Asia 2040 be published about a year ago, which has firm reference to education. I think the challenge for us in Australia right now is a lot of institutions are financially challenged, like in the UK, or maybe it's even worse in the UK because it's been a structural challenge in the UK for longer. But then is this inferred almost assumption that you can just switch from the one to the other without understanding that it actually takes a lot of investment to do international activity, and in particular to benefit from transnational education. And I'd dare to say if you only do it to make money, you shouldn't do it, because you will fail, because then you won't have the patience to actually build those relationships that will take your venture, whatever it is, whether it's a joint campus or a partnership, to the next level where students really get to benefit from that experience. So I think it's some really interesting challenges we're facing, that there is greater demand in the world for great quality international education, whether it's Australian or British education, for learners who can't afford to pay fees to come on shore. So how do we best do more of that? What might some of the policy incentives be? What could the next 5-10 years look like, Jamie?
Yeah, so I think, going back to one of the things that Leighton raised, I think it is around working with governments around the market access barriers. And so for universities, that's usually around kind of regulation and how you actually get set up as an institution. And what we actually need to do, rather than having, for our organisation, having 141 universities going away and doing that individually, it's far better to do that collectively. So government to government, or through organisations like the British Council, to actually understand what the kind of the needs are in a particular market, but also what those barriers are, and actually trying to work to address those. And I think there's been a really positive experience with India from that perspective, for example. But I think fundamentally, the drive for transnational education will come from the institutions involved and from the host in terms of what they need. So I think it's about really engaging with the host country and partners to understand what is going to work, rather than just going, we have a business course that we want to do because we think it's going to be lucrative. That's not the way for a long-term sort of collaboration. So yeah, I think it's about working with the host market, but actually trying as far as possible in what is a very competitive space to find those areas of collaboration as a sector as well. So how do we work together to understand those different needs in markets? So I think that's probably very helpful.
Yeah. Leighton, have you got any perspectives?
Yeah, I think, for me, it's interesting that data hides nuance, doesn't it? I mean, I was quite pleased to say that 30% of T&E comes from this region, right? But it comes from 4 geographies, right? It comes from China, it comes from Hong Kong, it comes from Malaysia, it comes from Singapore. If you make it into Pacific, it comes from Sri Lanka, right? That's 5 out of so many more countries. So I think the reality is T&E is part of an ecosystem, right? If you look at it, so the British Council's role, I think, is to be an honest broker. Right? I think just because a host government wants T&E, does that mean you necessarily have to do T&E, right? There's no obligation in that respect. And that's why, from my perspective, it really is about mutual benefit. It's reasonable to expect that T&E can wash its face, to borrow a phrase, right? It is it is a public good, it's a private good. It should be able to sustain itself. So I think the countries where T&E has blossomed has had the right environment, has had the right motivations, it has the right transformation. Singapore, I heard an interesting story about Singapore because I'm based there, of course. And the motivation for Singapore to bring in transnational education was to make Singapore an international education hub, right? To have students from around the region to travel to Singapore, right? That's not what happened, right? It does have a lot of students from around the region. It's not even right now where Singapore necessarily wants to be, is to have a ton of students from around the region, right? Because the world is complicated in that respect. But it's positively contributed to the rise of quality of education in Singapore. It's mirrored that same dramatic improvement in the quality of higher education in Singapore. Right? So it's part of a wider ecosystem. So I think for our perspective, it's really important to look at the context of the country you're in. As Jamie said, what is the government looking for? It doesn't mean you have to give it everything, but it does mean that it needs to be a good, welcoming environment. So we work a lot with governments in the region. I can't remember whether the phases were in the 3rd phase of T&E, or we're definitely at a different phase, right? And I think the ecosystem is very different. So Vietnam, for me, is a really interesting one, right? Because I think if you look at Malaysia, Hong Kong, China, and I can't remember what the last one is now. I've baffled myself, Malaysia probably. There's always been a healthy mobility trade, right? There's always been a number of students from those countries coming to the UK, and on the back of that, we built a further deepening relationship with teaching and learning. Vietnam is the next location, right? Vietnam does not have that same student mobility to the UK, right? The vast majority of students in Vietnam go to the US, and yet we've had a really great take-up of transnational education in Vietnam, much more so than even in Indonesia and Philippines and other governments that are very open to transnational education. In Vietnam, there is the appetite, the market for it. It's understood what T&E is and what value it brings, and that makes it viable for the UK to work in TNE. So I think Vietnam is an interesting location where you have more transnational education enrollments than you have student mobility, right, to the UK from that perspective. So it's fascinating what a different world we're in. But we did a piece of research with the UKI a few years ago to understand whether TNE cannibalized international student mobility. Right, this is when student mobility was seen as something to chase. And our conclusion at the time is they just serve different constituencies and different needs. And I think that's what needs to be understood, is they're complementary, no doubt, it's all part of the education system, but they don't address the same needs. And I think that's really important. So really understand the country, don't expect every country to function the same way for TNE or to have the same appetite for it, and work with organizations, hopefully like ourselves, small advert, to any British organizations looking, obviously, to understand the market, to make sure that you understand what the risks are. We're here to help de-risk what is a very worthwhile adventure.
Yeah, thank you for that, Leighton. We have a few minutes left. There's time for questions. If anybody has a question, yeah, Justin.
Question for Jamie. India is getting all the headlines at the moment, but I'm interested, which other markets are your universities looking at, in particular, which new or non-traditional markets are attracting attention?
Well, as you say, sort of India is attracting all of the attention at the moment, I think, from a lot of people. I think Nigeria has also been a real focus. With kind of new guidelines that have been produced there around kind of transnational education. Again, British Council and the UK government have been very closely involved in that, and just looking at the demographics as that. But none of that actually means that doing TNE is easy. In India, it's still very difficult. In Nigeria, it's still very challenging. It's just that there are kind of regulatory moves that have been made that make it a bit more attractive. But I think, again, as Leighton was saying, there's also a wide range of countries, particularly in kind of Southeast Asia, where there is a lot of interest. But again, I think one of the fundamental points is there's lots of different types of TNE, and we have 141 members. They don't have a single priority market, apart from probably India, actually, for a lot of people, just because of the size and scale. Every university will have slightly different perspectives on where those priorities are. But I think definitely Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia are where the kind of the growth is being looked at.
And maybe can I take any other questions? If not, I'll ask a question about quality assurance agencies. TEXA has a toolkit around transnational education, and there is support and a lot of discussion within the sector about how we retain quality in our approach. How does that work in the British context with the QAA?
Yeah. So we have 4 slightly different quality assurance regimes across the UK now. So England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland all have sort of slightly different approaches. England is the big outlier, sort of actually for lots of technical reasons that 3 minutes probably are not long enough to go into. But we do still have the Quality Assurance Agency, and they run a scheme which effectively helps to kind of kite mark sort of transnational education partnerships. So that's kind of complementary to the existing sort of regulatory sort of system that we have. Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland still use the QAA for doing that role within their systems. In England, that is now the provision of the Office for Students, though, which is currently not necessarily compliant with the European standards on quality assurance, which does create some international problems in terms of recognition. So that's been a real focus for our sector. But yeah, it really is about trying to ensure that the quality assurance system is understood by overseas partners, but actually recognizing that they will have their own regulatory standards and systems as well that you have to be able to work with. Mm-hmm.
Great, thanks, Jamie. And even having the nations as well, in addition to the number of institutions, that adds complexity. When we spoke last night about this panel today, we reflected on the Deakin Lancaster model. We thought about what are the ways in which we can work in a competitive world, and might there be areas where Britain and Australia can collaborate. So maybe any final thoughts on that before we close?
I mean, I'd like to add a point to what Jamie was saying, was I think good quality regulation at home is essential to transnational education. I think it's important to understand that transnational education is much bigger than what universities do. Mm-hmm. Right? If you look at UK awarding bodies, they are incredibly ubiquitous, right? They reach places that even the British Council does not reach. So I think what really gives the reputation to UK education overseas and Australian is how strong regulation is at home. That's why overseas governments trust to work with UK and Australian universities. The challenge that we find is how do you avoid double regulatory burden, right? So that to me is really important. sort of aspiration of what the British Council works on. And maybe that's an area where the UK and Australia can also collaborate, right? Is to have a look at how do you avoid duplicative regulatory burden, because high quality education is what everybody wants, but a barrier to a lot of it is regulatory burden. So I think it's an area, I know that Australia and New Zealand have done a lot of work in Southeast Asia as part of their ASEAN Dialogue partnership to work on quality assurance in the region. That makes it infinitely easier for institutions to work in those regions. But maybe there's also something we can do to increase the efficiency so that we can make it even easier to do those partnerships. And so I think the Lancaster, that was an interesting shoving together of names, wasn't it? Lancaster and Deakin University, I think is just illustrative of the fact that both countries are really good at T&E, very innovative in T&E, and it's another innovative model for transnational education. I think international branch campuses are only 1 in 10 of our T&E enrollments come from international branch campuses. But to most policymakers, it's the only type of T&E that they understand. But actually, it's way more creative than that, and I think that partnership is a really good illustration of that.
Yeah, and a great idea which we'll take through UUA colleagues around regulatory collaboration. Jamie, some final thoughts from you?
I think that's right. I think there are real opportunities in potentially collaborative approaches, but I think, just going back to something I said in my opening remarks, there's also working with third-party commercial providers as well that can sometimes have both the resource and the knowledge in country. And so I think we see more of those partnerships, which is the kind of the UK institution, an overseas partner facilitated by a commercial provider as well. And I think that's really blurring the lines on what is a branch campus and what's a partnership model as well.
Yeah, and some really interesting developments. Watch this space. Thank you very much for having joined us on this very fast-paced half-hour panel. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the afternoon.